From rural India to global policy tables, today's guest builds the maps others follow. He doesn't just study startups, he studies what makes them possible in the first place. Welcome to another episode of School to Startup, brought to you by Tracxn, a private market intelligence platform that's been supporting the global startup ecosystem for over a decade now. Through our university partnerships, we work with institutions driving innovation and entrepreneurship. And this series highlights the academic leaders making that happen. I'm Harish, your host today, and joining us is Professor Sreevas Sahasranamam, Professor of International Business and Entrepreneurship at Adam Business School, University of Glasgow. Welcome to the show, Professor Sreevas.
Thank you so much, Harish, for the invite. Looking forward to this conversation.
Great. So let's start from the beginning. What pulled you into the world of academia, and were startup always part of the picture?
So I think let me dial back the clock by 15 years. And this was during my undergrad engineering days. I am originally I was born in Tamil Nadu, but I was doing all my education in Kerala. So during those days, during my engineering days, there was a project around rural electrification that was focused on electrifying a small rural village, which was until then having not electricity. That project was one of those first real life hands-on experience that I was having when it comes to engaging on a real life project. Project done, it was like fancy news because it was about a student group that has electrified a village, all of that, right? So it comes with a fancy PR around it, all good. But a year and a half after that, the light bulbs went off. And that's when my light bulb went on. And why I use that metaphor is because thinking of it purely as an engineering project, I thought we did everything right. We pulled the right cables in, we made the right connections. It was good quality solar panels. It had the right batteries. The battery said it will last for 5 years. The panel said it will last for 8 years, whatever, right? So if I think about it purely as an engineer, which what I was at that point of time, I thought I did everything right. But year and a half, it did not work, right? And then I was like, why does this not work? If technology was the only solution that we needed to solve the problem, then it should have worked, at least for the time period that the battery said it will work and the solar panel said it will work. And probing into that is when we realized that the issues were around maintenance of the battery or cleaning up of the panels, those sorts of smaller things, which needed smaller pots of money, which the community had to put in to be able to sustain that. Now, part of the problem was the community themselves not having that pool of money to sustain it. And then sort of on the sites, I was hearing about social entrepreneurship models. I never knew what social entrepreneurship was at that point of time, but I was hearing other examples like Selco, and there was another venture called Global Himalayan Expedition that I was beginning to talk to. These ventures were doing similar rural electrification projects, but their projects were sustaining for a longer period of time. And then I was beginning to understand, okay, this is happening because they are thinking about it not just as a technology intervention, but they're thinking about it from the business support around it. Can it lead to productive use of energy? Like, can it lead to like a small venture, a shop, or a pashmina wool making unit? Or it could be as simple as something like a vegetable vendor stall, but if he has the light that is there from his house, he can probably run for 3 more hours in the evening. It could be something as simple as that. But that would mean that there is a additional pool of money that will really support the venture to be supported. And that will mean that they will invest at least part of the money to ensure that the electricity intervention continues to sustain. So that real insight from the field, along with what I was hearing as stories from other sources, really pushed me to think about social entrepreneurship and think about research in that space. And luckily, I got a position for PhD at the IAM in Kozhikode. And my PhD was essentially focused on social entrepreneurship, where I was looking at how do institutional conditions, by which I mean your formal institutions like political systems, your education, finance, how do those settings in the country level alongside cultural parameters, how does that influence social entrepreneurship entry and growth? And so this real life insight linked to what my initial PhD focus was really what got me into entrepreneurship and thinking about it from social entrepreneurship sort of lens to start with. And subsequently, I've sort of moved on from there to look at social, but not really looking at it from a country perspective, because country is too broad, right? Like in India, for example, if you see like what happens in central government and what happens in Kerala are like miles apart sometimes, right? So I was thinking, okay, this is probably too broad to look at it as just as a country level thing. So in the last 5 to 7 years, I've began to look at it more as regional ecosystems, either state or community-led innovations. So we are working on projects like rural entrepreneurship ecosystem building, where we are working with indigenous communities in Jabua, indigenous communities in Pandharpur, looking at how do you kind of build community-led organizing, how does that lead into creating of entrepreneurship ecosystems, things like that. So that's been the trajectory from a real life insight to macro national level things to now looking at it more as community and smaller group type efforts into entrepreneurship.
Very interesting. In fact, I have a follow-up question on rural innovation and ecosystems, right? See, you have worked on wide range of projects from rural innovation to digital ecosystems. Which one really made you feel, okay, this could change how we think about entrepreneurship?
The one big thing is, let me give you a story and then you will know why I'm saying that's the big thing. So this is 2 years ago. I was in Araku Valley. Okay. The reason why I was in Araku Valley was we had got some funding to look at blockchain in agriculture. So there was a startup that was implementing blockchain in the coffee supply chain. And we were looking at how do startups build ecosystems in like rural, but powered by digital, right? So blockchain is a digital technology. So looking at how digital gets implemented at the level of farms and farmers, and how do they get interlinked to the broader supply chain, which was your Tata Coffee, Blue Togai, those sorts of actors. So the field visit was meant to understand what happens with blockchain. But on one of the evenings, I was just getting chai from the roadside. And just for the global audience, if they are listening to this, the Indian audience will know what I mean by roadside chai, but the global audience might think of a Starbucks. But I'm not thinking of a Starbucks here, but I'm thinking about 4 poles of bamboo and a sheet on top. Okay, and a lady giving me chai from the can. I got the chai and she said it cost me 10 rupees, like 10 cents in UK terms. And I was going to my wallet to say, like, okay, 10 rupees, because in my head, I am thinking like the most trusted form of financial transaction is going to be hard currency being given. But before I could take the money out, this lady shows me a QR code. Right now, you know where I'm going with the story, but for the audience, which might be global, that might not have learned about the story, this tells you a number of things, right? One, that this lady trusts digital payments. Now, if she has to trust that, she needs to first have a bank account. Now, if she has to have a bank account, she needs to first have an identity. Now, unlike in UK or a US setting where you get a birth certificate when you are born, in this setting, you don't get that. Now, all these things, you dial back 10, 15 years back of India, was not something which you will expect to happen, but this is what is happening, right? Now, you know this is the UPI story, you know this is the Aadhaar story, but all of this story has essentially played out in the last 7 to 8 years in a really strong way. So the strand of thought that is really interesting for me, where we are doing multiple work now, is the intersection between what we are calling as digital commons, which in the Indian case, it's the UPI, Aadhaar, that sort of a thing. And there are similar versions of it playing out in other global south countries. For example, I was in Sri Lanka a couple of months ago, where there is a private, so the Indian version is more of a government-led effort, right? So it's the government directly involved in it in some way. But in Sri Lanka, there is a government-led effort, but there's also a private effort that's very similar to our ONDC. So it's a private venture which kind of started out as a market stall. So they continue to do every Saturday, they have a weekend stall. And ideas from that, they have now translated into creating a digital marketplace, which is again open source, digital commons based. And it's not just a Sri Lanka story now, it's now in 100 or 100 plus countries, right? So we are beginning to see what really these commons based, open source, open protocol based mechanisms can do, not just as a technology stuff. I think like I am not a technology person, right? I don't know. If you ask me to tell you like how does backend protocol work, I'm like, I don't know. But I am really interested, like if you give that, and if that's like your roadways and or the highways, and we have talked about logistics improving entrepreneurship. Now, if this digital infrastructure is your new logistics, what does that mean for entrepreneurship innovation to happen on top? So that is the space that's super exciting for me, and it naturally links to all the other things for me in some way. Right? It's about rural, it's about informal becoming formal, it's about social having a marketplace, it is about digital removing inequalities which used to exist. So that one thread, I think, has intersections with a lot of the other things that I've done in the past, and it's really shaping where I think my research and interests are really going into the future.
Very interesting. I think you answered most part of my next question, the first half of the question, right? So going back to the second question, second part of the question, what have those communities taught you that places like Silicon Valley might miss?
So one is how we are thinking about community organizing and community governance. Okay, let me take, let's say, a Sri Lanka example and an Udupi example. So you have two different contexts to maybe think of. In Sri Lanka, what they have done is they have created like a participatory guarantee mechanism of how they would vet the people who are on the marketplace. Okay. Now, this is all about your sustainability oriented ventures that are on this marketplace, right? So they have a verification mechanism called good market verification. And how this mechanism works is it replicates what happens in a physical world, but done through digital mechanisms, right? So they continue to have some of this field visit monitoring, but it's also possible for somebody to, let's say, flag online saying, okay, I purchased it from this person. This venture is verified on your system, but I purchased from this person, or I went to this person's farm, but I don't think he's meeting this criteria. So anybody from an open source global community, because all the information is transparent on the website, right? All criteria is on the website, all checks and balances that were done to approve them is on the website. So it's now possible for a transparent mechanism to really check and verify and report if need be, right? So that is really interesting in terms of how you translate from, this is what will happen in a physical world, right? Physical world, if it is just a physical stall, you will always have people like, okay, I got this from you last week. It did not like taste the same way it tasted the previous week, right? You will do that in a physical world. Now, how can you translate that into a virtual world? This was interesting in terms of how you build these participatory guarantee mechanisms in terms of governance and monitoring into an online setting. There's also another example of Open Supply Hub. This is based out of the US. What they do is they again have for your entire supply chains, for let's say your DHL or your Walmarts, the entire sourcing from let's say farm to fork or farm to table is entirely captured on their online system. Now, when that's transparent, again, it's possible for it to flag and all of that, right? So there are these interesting open source, open protocol, digitally transparent mechanisms, partly powered by blockchain in some instances, not really powered by blockchain in other instances, but at the end of the day, ensuring the transparency is coming. And that's been one interesting insight in terms of how do you translate this from physical setting to a global setting. The example from Udupi, where there's a similar effort called eSamudai, and what they do again is they work on top of ONDC to ensure that your small vendors could be linked and all of that. Now there, the interesting thing for me is the formalization part, right? So they gave me this example of a vegetable vendor who started off as a push cart, okay? And he was onboarded into their system because they had digital inventory, everything that was mapped. 1 year down the line, he sort of went from the push cart to a kiosk. 2 years down the line, went from a kiosk to a rented store, right? Now, all of this happened because not just because they had digital marketplace presence, but because the audit trail now was available digitally. And that meant the person could go and raise finance against the audit trail. Like otherwise, you would go to a bank, ask for collateral. What collateral do I have? Right now, you have the audit trail as the mechanism for collateral getting, and that credit is now helping you to expand and grow and all of that. And that was another interesting insight from an Indian setting, for example.
Very interesting. And when you zoom out from those on the ground experiences to the policy level, you have helped shape startup policy for G20. What's the biggest mindset shift governments need when it comes to supporting the real innovation?
So there's two ways in which I'll think about this. The first thing is like when you work, or from my experience of working at like a G20 type setting, sometimes I kind of have a bit of frustration that it's like there's so much talk, and like even when you have these policy documentations being created, sometimes you don't really know what that translates into, right? Like you often see like a lot of effort when we kind of have these meetings to kind of put into like what goes into as specific words and action points or whatever. But like year down the line, when you kind of go back and ask like, okay, have we followed up on any of the action points? Sometimes, okay, yeah, we will come back to it, right? So there is that bit. And linked to that is also the point of when you talk about G20, the presidencies keep changing, right? Like it was 2023, the Indian presidency is when I was the co-chair for the sustainability task force. So it's very closely linked to that system. And then like last year, I was an advisor for under the Brazil presidency with the ESG group. So it's a similar group. The name changed from sustainability to ESG, but focus was same. But I felt that from a priority standpoint, it changed drastically, right? Like so, like in an ideal world, I would expect like subsequent presidencies to in some way draw on and build on and actionate things that were said in the previous years. But it was almost like coming across in sometimes that like within Brazil or within this year South Africa, like it's about what that country needs. Like, but then G20 is not meant to be at least in my head, it's not meant to be like what the national priority is, but it's about what the global priorities are. Like this is the overarching organization and not the country government organization. Like you have your government organization to do what you want as a country priority. This has to have a bit more of an abstraction on top of it, which I think sometimes is a bit of a miss, especially when it comes to these multi-country, multilateral sort of a space. So that's my reflection on that. Now my reflection on specific governments and like just one government, those sorts of things, there it's been like, how can you engage with these audiences, right? So because I am 100% sure that they're not going to come and read my 40-page article, which is put in some paywall journal somewhere that's staying in some repository. So what I've really realized in the last 3 to 4 years particularly is the way we have to communicate research to non-research audiences is probably the key thing when it comes to engaging with government and policymakers, which personally I've tried to do it with writing blogs, being on podcasts like this, exploring alternate formats of content dissemination, which hopefully starts piquing the interest of different people. Now, it has helped to some extent, where like, let's say a couple of years ago, so I co-lead what is called as the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And what we do within that is we track entrepreneurial trends and attitudes across countries. So for the last 3-4 years, I am one of the co-authors of this global annual report. And India is also one of the countries where data is collected every year. Okay. So EDIA collects data within India, and it's an annual survey-based mechanism that happens every year. So 3 years ago, when we had this report out, one of the interesting India insights that we kind of got is India was really going up the ranking when it comes to ease of doing business, kind of the quality of the ecosystem when it comes to starting up. So India was really seeing a push on that. So we ensure that we tried and communicate that through blogs and media outreach, like newspapers and all of that. that was super interesting in terms of the people who picked up, including the Prime Minister, right? So we saw the Prime Minister tweeting about it, right? So like, this is like, I don't think it would have happened had we not communicated it in that sort of a format. Like 100% PMO office not going to come and read my 100-page report which stays in a repository, like 100% not, right? So it's important that we start communicating in smaller formats, interesting formats like podcasts, like other short formats, to really communicate with policy audience, non-policy practitioner audience, and with students and other sort of general public type audience. And that's another key insight that I've gathered over the last 3-4 years when it comes to how should we, or how can we think about engaging with policy and government and actors like that.
Amazing. So before we go deeper, a quick pause for everyone who are watching. If you're enjoying this conversation, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Tracxn channel. We've got more episodes coming your way featuring the people shaping how startups are built across the world. Right. Coming back, the what you told now connects to another part of your work, right? Digital public infrastructure. Things like India Stack have changed who can access entrepreneurship. What's something people often miss when we talk about trust, not just tech?
Interesting question. My first reaction to that question would be, there's partly the issue of how much people, let's say in the Western world or the global world, really know what's happening, right? So I will give this funny anecdote. I mean, like, I was talking to somebody and told them about like what I'm doing and all of that. Told them the story that I told you earlier about this Araku Valley lady and all of that. And then they say like, how come we haven't seen this? Or how come we don't know this? And I said like there's obviously some documentation, even we are writing some, there's other things that are already going on. But I don't think I've seen this in the FT. Okay. So I'm like, okay, if it's not news, I'm like FT, I'm just taking as an example. I'm just kind of saying, like if it's not news in a output which is of a certain background or whatever. I'm not the political economist in this group, so I will not go into deeper discussion on that. But then this sort of thinking of like, if it's not there, it's not exist, right? Like, but that's not how world works, right? Like global South stories are not in general talked at length in some of these Western portals in any ways, right? So just because it's not there doesn't mean it doesn't exist or it's not trustworthy. Like going to your question of trust. So I think there is part of that in some, like which is about how do you build the conversation around it? How do you maybe engage in advocacy? How do you engage in more of the knowledge building around the space in the first place, around commons? Because for me, if you look at how global internet is in some way spread, you have what's called as the corporation-centered Western sort of internet. You have some of a state-led Chinese internet. And for me, the commons-led is the third pillar, right? Now, have we really thought about as that pillar? I don't really know. Or have we communicated it in that way? I don't really know. Yes, like the good thing is actions being taken towards that end, right? So there's, for example, there is this 50 in 5 campaign that is now being led by the UN with co-develop and few of the other foundations and all of them. And what that is trying to do is to draw lessons from India and other places to replicate the DPI effort in 50 other countries in the next 5 years, right? So efforts like that is beginning to in some way spread the idea. And I think more of that we really need to do. And there's a DPI summit that's also organized for the second year now, happening this year in South Africa. So those sorts of efforts really need to be ramped up alongside more of the communication and what does it really mean? Like you can always say that like it's good, like anecdote is good. Like I can always say this Araku Valley story and get a few claps. But the point is it shouldn't stop at that. We also need proper evidence-backed mechanism to understand why it is effective, or like to build a trust really, you need evidence-backed mechanisms to say, okay, because of this thing happened, or over a period of time, this has changed, and that means these things changed. So I think we now want to get into that phase where we can really do some of that evidence-backed input to really make the case for what it is doing and what it's not doing also. And that will help build the trust alongside more of this global convening and conferencing and all of that.
Interesting. So let's talk about the students for a second, right? So you have helped set up startup ecosystem for students and for founders in places with no funding, no network, and sometimes no Wi-Fi as well.
Mhm.
So have you ever felt like you were the entire ecosystem?
Okay. So let me caveat that by saying all my projects have been with strong partners, right? I don't think I've done anything by myself. I am probably the least contributor in all of these efforts. So, for example, like the example that you're taking, about what we have done in, let's say, Jabua or Pandharpur or Durgapur, we had a strong university partner in India in the form of IS, which has been working in those spaces for a long period of time, right? So there again, going back to your previous question of building trust, you cannot drop into these communities and expect whatever you say will be implemented next day. 100% not going to happen, right? So the fact that we had a partner in TIS, which has been working in this space for long, helped partly. And then in addition to TIS, we also had local partners, right? In the case of Jabua, it was somebody called Shivganga Jabua. They have been working in these communities on collective action, indigenous tribe, youth empowerment, all of that, right? So, and they have been at it for 15 years before we engage in this project. TIS has been involved with them for about 10 years. They have been doing this on the field from 2007 or something like that, right? So for efforts like this to really connect and really make any substantial effort or meaning at the ground, you need to engage with local partners with that strong local engagement roots over long periods of time, because that's needed for communities to really engage and sort of involve with whatever we are saying. Part one. Part two is, even when we bring this in, there is like a certain degree of maybe resistance, if you want to call it that way, or it's just lack of knowing what it means, right? So to go back to the Jabua example itself, there was like TIS mentioned to me like a very interesting anecdote from their training program, which was like on one of the days they were doing this training about basic financial cash flow, like money coming in, money going out. Okay. And in that they were like saying, okay, seeds cost me this much, fertilizer cost me this much, I like the water cost is this much, all of that they kind of put it in, and they kind of arrive at a price as to what is the price of what it takes to create whatever they were creating. And then they said, okay, I will go to this market and I will sell it at this price. Okay. And they kind of then taught them as to what profit is. It's a difference between what they get to go there and what you make. And then they was like, what about labor? And they're like, what do you mean by labor? Okay. So like you are doing the work, right? Like, so like, okay, that's the cost. Okay. Like, so like simple things like that, you probably are not sort of thinking about it, because that's not the norm, because this is extremely close-knit communities that we are talking about. And for them, working in my farm opposed to working in my next plot is the same, because like that's my Jija or that is my Barbie's plot or whatever, right? So so that level of transactional element in a proper financial world, Tracxn world, in some way, you start wanting to capture it as cost. But in those worlds, these are not cost, because they don't think of this as cost, right? Like, because they for example, in Jabua, like they have this tradition called Halma. Halma basically means that every, like if there is somebody who is in need of help, they make a call for Halma, and then somebody else in the community will definitely answer the call. This could be anything from distress calls to helping on the field, but that's how these communities have sustained for ages. Now, if that's the tenant or the basic tenant of how these communities work, when you introduce capitalism or when you introduce entrepreneurship and say like, okay, now we work on market terms, like market doesn't come out of the blue in one day, right? Like you need to handhold them from that, this is extremely good, right? What they're doing is super important. Now, how can you make these smaller bridges between that world and this world is where I think a lot more of hand-holding that the likes of Tess and others are doing really comes into the fold. So that hopefully gives you some of this feel about that intersection.
Amazing. And for the students or the early founders, sometimes they feel there is a lot of pressure to monetize fast, right?
Yeah.
So what do you say to them who are torn between solving real problems and pitching to the investors?
So personally, I've always been like a strong advocate wherever possible of bootstrapping as a mechanism to take it to a certain degree of scale before you're kind of looking at, because like the moment VCs come in, you have other different types of pressures coming into it. So that's sort of general this thing. But going deeper, when we really engage with ecosystems like rural and social and all of that, you oftentimes have this conflict between what's really the impact, right? Because like it's not always about the economic impact, especially in these settings, 100% not, right? Like, but the other metrics of measurement are not quantifiable in some instances. Some of them are. Now there's this global impact investing network and others who try to quantify impact measures, but still they're not hard quantifiable in many instances, right? So that's been a struggle when it comes to communicating the impact with stakeholders like VCs and external investors, because in the purely economical terms, you probably don't make much money, but can you also now look at that, right? So I've increasingly become a strong advocate of, where possible, think of blended financing models, which will have a combination of some bit of philanthropy, some bit of debt, some bit of VC. Debt, I'm thinking more interestingly about bond type debt, right? Like you have these green bonds and all of that, right? So those combination of blended finance, I think is really what will help push this, right? Because like purely philanthropy has restrictions. It does not think about exit. It builds dependency, all of that. So I'm not this charity model. I'm not a fan. But I know the proper VC might not really work either, because if you push purely on those economic terms, you probably don't make it. But can we get blended right? And increasingly, I'm seeing different examples of this beginning to work well. So hopefully, we find more of that sweet spot somewhere in between to really make this work.
Interesting. So quick fire time now. Just say whatever comes to your mind.
Okay.
Most overused buzzword in entrepreneurship.
Unicorn.
And a book you always recommend to your students.
So there's a book called Disciplined Entrepreneurship that kind of has this multiple stages of thinking and stuff. So I get students to usually use that almost when they are building this. So at our MBA level, we have a course called, like in the summer, some of the students are asked to work on startup plans, and we kind of essentially get them to work through those steps to create the plan and all of that. So that's the book that I'll recommend.
Interesting. One thing every incubator should have.
Strong mentoring. Hard infrastructure is good as a start, but if you don't support that, the soft infrastructure of mentoring and network and the rest of it, I've had a number of examples of machines just staying in buildings. Like, we don't want more machines staying in buildings. We want people to be working with them.
Interesting. Entrepreneurship in one smell.
Liberating, because it kind of gives you a lot of agency, individual choice, all of that. And we are working with a organization called Beggars Corporation. That's where I've seen this most powerfully come out, where they work on converting beggars into entrepreneurs. Like everything else I've seen, like there's been some different backgrounds, but this was, I think, the sort of, you kind of keep talking about extreme cases, right? This is like ultimate dependency in some way, because you're kind of on the streets begging. And how are you kind of transitioning in 6 months to a year to start thinking about entrepreneurship? So liberating is the one word that I will use.
Interesting. And if you weren't doing any of this, what would you be doing?
I think I probably would have done something in the policy think tank, that sort of space, something.
That was very interesting. So Professor Shrivas, looking ahead, how do you see academia's role evolving in the startup space, especially in developing countries?
The core insight that I'm having in there is how entrepreneurship shouldn't be thought as outcome venture, but how entrepreneurship needs to be thought as mindset or skill, right? You may start a venture, but that's not what the training is just meant for. To give you the example of, like, I was previously working in the University of Strathclyde, and 3, 4, 5 years ago, they had a shift in the strategy where they said, like, entrepreneurship is going to be the center pillar for the university, which meant that everybody, from any student coming into the university to any academic who is in the university, will get a basic entrepreneurship training online course. Okay, that you can always debate as like effectiveness, and we're not kind of getting into that. But then just that thinking of keeping that as a center pillar, and then everything is like, if you have the thinking, then you will start thinking about things different ways. Now, I don't call myself to be a practical entrepreneur, as like I don't build anything or service anything, but I see myself as an entrepreneur who is like an academic entrepreneur, right? Like the fact that I kind of work with different types of these actors, engaging in like cross-cutting inputs. That's where I see myself being an academic entrepreneur, if you want to call it. And it's about that translation of insight from research to policy, translation of insight between practicing organizations. That's how I see myself as an entrepreneur. Now, in a proper definition, I'm not formally registered. I'm not on a World Bank enterprise survey, but I still see myself as that in this way. So the key thing for me is, if we can shift this thinking, especially within academic university settings, where we see entrepreneurship in some way as a center pillar, where like engineering could prototype stuff, your humanities could do social impact startup that are spun off from those sort of settings. So can we do it in that way? And academics could be like these sorts of ways, right? It could be technology transfer, which is good, but it could also be about social impact spinouts. Now that's something that we are kind of working closely as a strategy in Scotland, where we don't think just about technology transfer, because like technology institutions like IITs and all of them will always think about patent and startup spin-off. Now, what do you do in a social science setting? There's nothing of a patent, right? Like what I'm saying is nobody can really patent it, but it can become the social impact spin-offs. That's the term that we are using. And the way that's structured, it's about building networks together. It's about community network. It's about research consulting, or it's about think tank oriented work, all of that. But it's sort of as a spun off of research activity that's been happening in the university. And that's sort of an emerging space. In Scotland, there are multiple universities which have now started doing this. There are 3, 4 ventures which have come out of this. One on climate litigation. It's about like lawyers, but it's a tech tool of climate litigation that came out of one of the universities that's helping with doing litigation around climate issues and all of that, right? So those examples are what we probably need to see. Don't think just as tech, but think of these settings as well.
Very interesting. And before we wrap, where can people follow your work or stay up to the date on what you're working on?
I think the best place would be LinkedIn, which is where I sort of very strongly engage with. I can give you the link and maybe you put it on the description or something. And hopefully there are people who are interested in what we had a chat about. And if they're interested, they can follow me there. I am most active there in terms of my outreach on LinkedIn.
Great. That was a masterclass in building ecosystems where entrepreneurship isn't just a buzzword. It's a real pathway to the impact. A huge thank you, Professor Sreevas, for joining us today. And for our viewers, if you have enjoyed the conversation, just like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss an episode from School to Startup.